kingdom of Judah was actually given by the Portuguese slave traders. Now, let's take an even closer look at the auto-da-fés. The act was started by what is called the Procession of the Penitents. The process began at the doorway of the Inquisitor's Palace, located on the Plaza of San Domingo, and worked its way toward the Central Plaza. At the front of the procession, the Inquisitors marched with their crucifix, carrying torches, whose black veils symbolized that Christ was in mourning for the heretics. The prisoners were escorted and guarded by the inquisitorial militia. Each was accompanied by two familiars of the Inquisition. Those who were sentenced to receive the punishment of public flogging also had a knotted noose or a cord around their neck as a sign that they would receive lashes or go to the galleys, or eventually be hung and burned at the stake. The images that you're seeing on your screen is from the Procession of the Penitents that would have taken place on the auto-da-fé, reenacted yearly in Spain. And these other images are the Ku Klux Klan in America. Is this just a coincidence that the auto-da-fés were mostly executions of Negro Jews, and the Ku Klux Klan is an organization whose sole purpose is to execute the Negro and hate Jews? Both start with a procession, with the militia holding crosses and torches on their way to lynch and potentially burn alive. Both were considered as arms of the church. Both believed that the murder of the Negro was a auto-da-fé, or an act of faith. When a competent number of the prisoners are convicted of heresy, either by their own voluntary or exhorted confession, or upon the evidence of witness, a day is fixed by the chief inquisitor for a gold delivery, which is called by them an auto-da-fé, or act of faith, and which is always upon a Sunday. The caveat against the Pretender being a short but impartial history of some of the assassinations, murders, and inhumane slaughters committed by Papists, by J. Morley, 1723. Dillon waited in hope for the next auto-da-fé, and after a length of time, he was roused one night by the gaolers bearing lights. Having dressed himself and put on a black garment striped with white lines and a pair of drawers, which they had brought for him, he was led into the gallows for hanging, where he joined about 200 other prisoners, all ranged against the walls. They were mostly colored men. Well, let me say it again. They were mostly colored men, there being only about 12 white persons amongst the 200. The Inquisition revealed in its origin, policy, cruelty, and history in Spain, Portugal, and France by Reverend Thompson Timpson. When we look closely at the auto-da-fés, we can see the lynching of Jesse Washington, Emmett Till, Rosewood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Wilmington, North Carolina, the Red Summer of 1919, when murderous riots and the destruction of whole towns took place in Negro communities all over the country, which is eerily similar to the events that took place all over Portugal in ghettos in the 14th to the 16th century. The rabble of Lipson, and determined to massacre the Jews, They were again addressed by a monk who cried out that it was that accursed race alone who were responsible for the deadly pestilence that caused so much havoc in Portugal in 1506. The origin of all the misfortune of Portugal and Europe were traced to these blasphemers of the Holy Mother of God. This was enough. The mob goaded into a roaring frenzy, headed by John Moco and Frei Bernardo, both monks of the Order of St. Dominic, who fiercely incited the rabble of at least 10,000 degraded and cruel ruffians to the most disgraceful deeds. Laurent, a secretary of the Court of Blood, says of this massacre in her book, Critical History of the Inquisition, that they slew and mangled their victims, casting many while still alive into the fires. The Negroes and the vilest rabble had kindled at the church doors, to which they kept constantly adding fuel. On Monday, the numbers of the mob were considerably increased from the surrounding villages. The massacre and butchery of the new Christians was continued. The houses were broken, whole families being murdered. The merciless wretches dashed out the brains of the infants against the wall. Pregnant women were thrown from windows on pikes of those below. Women were outraged, and virgins were violated. Such were the horrors committed in the capital of Portugal in that day. 12 centuries of Jewish persecution, a brief outline of the sufferings of the Hebrew race in Christian lands, by Gustav Perelson, 1898. So in the massacre of 1506 in Portugal, according to the author, they slew and mangled their victims while casting many still alive into the fire. Negroes. The writer even calls this quote the massacre and butchery of the new Christians. Remember, it was the black Portuguese Jews who were converted to be new Christians. So what was the name of this particular massacre? Venimus do Massacre Judaico in 1506 in Rossio Square, right outside the Church of St. Dominic, as the writer confirms. The mob goaded into a roaring frenzy, headed by John Moco and Frei Bernardo, both monks of the Order of St. Dominic, who fiercely incited the rabble of at least 10,000 degraded and cruel ruffians to the most disgraceful deeds. There are walking tours of this place in Libsyn to this day. The estimate is that nearly 4,000 people were executed that day. This is the same location where slaves gathered for different forms of spiritual assistance and brotherhood during the start of the slave trade in the 15th century. Then there are unknown, unnamed massacres and mass graves. For instance, in the March of 2019, an interesting discovery was found in Lagos, Portugal, in a rubbish dump. A mass grave of more than 150 Africans found with their hands bound and tied behind their backs. These mass graves were created between the 15th and the 17th century, the same time period of the Inquisitions and the Auto da Fés, aka persecution of the Negro Jews of Portugal. Even more interesting is the state that these bodies were found in, hands tied behind their back. So let's see if we can connect the dots in the 15th and 17th century. It is well-established history that in France alone, thousands of Jews were burned at the stake. On one occasion, 160 men and women and children were bound hand and foot and thrown into a ditch. Wood was piled on them and the torch applied, while numbers of the priests stood by with uplifted hands, calling on their Savior to witness the suffering of the unbelieving Jews. Whole families were burned in this funeral for the reason that these pious Christians could not see them separated. Commentaries on Christian and Hebrew Mythologies by Ladd Parrish. Then there's the unnamed massacres of Macombo, which were so many that the Negroes that were killed there were left for dead in the streets, to the point that King Emmanuel said, "They are not buried as well as they should be. They are thrown on the ground in such a manner that they are discovered and eaten by dogs." So a neighborhood that was once known as a refuge for Negroes fleeing persecution became a house of horrors. Emmanuel in 1515, less than 10 years after Vidimus Du massacre Judaico in Rossio Square, which is only 1.5 miles from Macombo, ordered a massive grave site known as Pocos dos Negros, the Black's Pit, to be built there. And where was it built? On the corner of Jude Street, Travessa do Judeu. One more interesting phenomenon that was birthed during this period of mass executions and unmarked graves of the Black Yahudim are the Gothic bone churches that began to spring up. Yes, I said bone churches. Churches that was built with the bones and skeletons of the dead built into the walls of the cathedrals. One such instance is Capela dos Ossos, the Chapel of Bones, in Évora, Portugal, built between 1460 and 1510, during the time of Vidimus Du massacre Judaico, which occurred in 1506. The chapel sits in the Church of St. Francis and was built from bones from Franciscan monks. According to the story, the monks built the chapel out of bones to solve the problem of cemeteries taking up space in Évora. Remember, having a lack of space to bury dead bodies was the same problem that occurred in Macombo because of the auto da fés, to the point that King Emmanuel had to commission Pocos dos Negros, the Negro's Pit. See, there's another curious element to the auto da fés that might shed some light on why a person might hang something from a condemned dead person's body in a church as a memento. This habit of the penitent and sackcloth of condemned heretics is to be hung up in the church of that parish where they dwell, that these sort of ensigns may be a monument to keep the everlasting remembrance of the impiety. For the name of the heretics and the reasons of their condemnation are to be inscribed and renewed on them. The History of the Inquisition by Lembrock Philippus, 1633-1712. So during the auto da fés, or acts of faith, the clothes of the convicted dead were hung up in the churches on display as a memorial of their execution and condemnation. One example of the hanging of dead victims' clothing and creation of the bones of the Negroes during the auto da fés takes us all the way to Rwanda, where in 1994, the genocide of more than 800,000 Hutus and Tutsis took place. One of the lesser known facts about the genocide is the role that the Catholic Church played. In an article by The Guardian labeled Rwanda Genocide, Catholic Church sorry for the roles of priests and nuns in killings, the author wrote, "The Catholic Church in Rwanda apologized on Sunday for the church's role in the 1994 genocide, saying it regretted the actions of those who participated in the massacres. We apologize for all the wrongs the church committed. We apologize on behalf of all Christians for all forms of wrongs were committed." The statement acknowledged that the church members planned, aided, and carried out the genocide, in which more than 800,000 ethnic Tutsis and moderate Hutus were killed by Hutu extremists. In Rwanda, in the territory of the Tarma, a church has been immortalized because of the brutal slaughter that took place there during the Rwandan tragedy. This Catholic church, just like the out of the phase of the past, has the victims, the Negroes, clothing hanging from the rafters as a memorial, and also an ossuary of the bones of the said victims. The interesting thing about the Franciscan Bone Chapel is that the Franciscans were fierce enemies of the Jews and were the catalyst behind riots that led to massacres of Jews in Navarre. During the 15th century, the Franciscan monks were very active in fomenting hatred towards the Jews. A History of the Jewish People, edited by H.H. Ben Sanson. In 1328, the Jews in Navarre were massacred when the murderous mob was inflamed by a Franciscan monk named Pedro Aliguin. A Psychoanalytic History of the Jews by Abner Falk. The church, too, now became more deeply involved since the Franciscan Pedro Aliguin was generally considered one of the main ringleaders of the pogroms. The Social and Religious History of the Jews by Salto Whitmire Barron. So what's a pogromist? A pogromist is a person who leads a violent riot aimed at the massacre or expulsion of an ethnic or religious group, particularly one aimed at the Jews. The hatred against the Jews burned with a frenzy. It is certain that suddenly through the whole country, a bloodthirsty enmity rose against the Jews, prompted by the envy of their riches and fostered by the monks. A Franciscan named Pedro Aliguin made himself most prominent in goading on the deluded mob against the innocent Jews. In the large congregation of Estella, a most horrible massacre began on the Sabbath. The Jewish quarter, breaking them down and slaying almost all the Jews of the city. They also set fire to Jewish houses and reduced them to ashes. History of the Jews by Professor H. Griggs. So whose bones are these in these churches? You do the math. These barbaric scenes of masses of Negroes hung from nooses, burned alive, or beaten just to be left in the byways. Rotting corpses laying on the ground like leaves falling from a shaking tree were the precursors to atrocities that were to be continued, transported from Portugal to the motherland, and eventually carried across the Atlantic to the New World. As in the words of Billie Holiday, southern trees bear a strange fruit. Blood on the leaves and blood on the root. Black bodies swinging in southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from poplar trees. The pastoral scene of the gallant South. The bulging eyes, the twisted mouth. The scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here's a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange